Hello, and welcome to Voices from the Left. I'm your host, Craig. Thanks for listening. This is a recording of a guest appearance I made on the 805 Uncensored podcast, along with Bob Buzzanco from the Green and Red podcast. Bob, Jordon, and I discuss U.S. foreign policy, especially the war crimes committed by liberal presidents.
Hello, you're listening to the 805 Uncensored, a show on the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network hosted by three leftists, though tonight it's just me. Heather and Cammie were not able to join. On the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network, we're on occupied Chumash and Timucuan land. This podcast covers a variety of topics from music to politics, news, philosophy, and more. There are no limits, which is why we are uncensored. So please follow us on your podcast and social media platforms of choice. This episode, we've got Craig from Voices from the Left, and we've also got Robert from the Green and Red podcast?
Green and Red podcast, yep.
Perfect. So I'll just start with introductions. Why don't you go ahead and go first, Craig?
So as Jordan said, I'm Craig, host of Voices from the Left podcast. Looking forward to this discussion. Jordan and I have collaborated quite a few times, so it should be pretty old hat for us, but I'm excited to talk to Robert Buzzanco here, the subject matter expert in our topic tonight. So,
yeah, I'll pass it over to Rob.
Hi, I'm Bob Buzzanco. You can call me Bob. Co-host of the Green and Red podcast with Scott Parkin. The green is for like environmental issues, and the red is anti-capitalism. So that's where it comes from, and we talk about that a lot. And also a history professor at the University of Houston. I've written extensively about the Cold War, Vietnam War, political economy, things like that. So I know a little bit. I would not call myself an expert. I'm always reluctant to do that because that's the Jacobin people in New York. They're the experts.
An intellectual heavyweight, nonetheless. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to just talk about, another light subject, U.S. foreign policy post-World War II, going into the 60s. Going to split it up into two parts. So this will be part one tonight, and then we'll record stuff after the 60s at a later date. So
Jordan, the Puppies and Rainbows episode, that's upcoming, right? Stay tuned. Soon.
We'll have some fun stuff for Halloween.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to be just talking about a few different presidential administrations. Tonight we're going to be covering Truman, JFK, and LBJ, and then part two will be covering Carter, Clinton, and Obama. So I like to start with this little segment about Chomsky. So Chomsky delivered this in 1990. He said, if the Nuremberg laws were applied today, then every post-war president, meaning World War II, would have been hanged by violation of the Nuremberg laws. I mean, the same kind of crimes for which people were hanged in Nuremberg. And Nuremberg means Nuremberg and Tokyo. So first of all, you've got to think back as to what people were hanged for at Nuremberg and Tokyo. And once you think back, the question doesn't even require a moment's waste of time. For example, one general at the Tokyo trials, which were the worst, General Yamashita, was hanged on the grounds that troops in the Philippines, which were technically under his command, though it was so late in the war that he had no contact with them, it was the very end of the war, and there were some troops running around the Philippines who he had no contact with, had carried out atrocities. So he was hanged. Well, try that one out, and you've already wiped out everybody. So, you guys have any thoughts about that, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's right. If you look at just kind of everybody, right, from Truman onward, even Jimmy Carter, who I think actually has been was admirable in his post-presidency. But yeah, they're clearly were involved in daily in foreign policy actions that violated all kinds of international policies. Along with the example you just gave about the Japanese official, one of the people at Nuremberg who was convicted was I can't remember his first name, but his last name was Keitel, and he was actually a propagandist. He was like a cartoonist who was making these dehumanizing Jews and things like that in his propaganda, and that violated the convention. So if you look at something like that, then obviously what we've seen from the Cold War onward, and what we're seeing today, obviously in some of the most ugly ways in Gaza and elsewhere, really does fit that standard of war criminal. So it's an easy call. I don't even think, like, if you're open-minded about it, you can't really question it.
Right.
Yeah, it reminds me of something we heard either late last year or early this year, when the ICJ and the World Court were brought into the fold for what's happening in Gaza right now. And I don't remember who it was, probably Lindsey Graham. It was some US nutbag in politics and basically flat out said the quiet part out loud. Well, that all of those things, that doesn't apply to the United States. That's for us to use against people like Putin. Like, no, that might be what you think, but that's not how it's supposed to work, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like
Yeah,
Truman's a no-brainer. Like we
yeah.
got Nagasaki, Hiroshima. There's more than that too. And then of course this is very contextual. This is all based on the U.S. demanding a total surrender from Japan, which just is completely skipped over in U.S. classrooms and when you're being taught about this. I actually didn't find out that they demanded a total surrender until pretty recently. So their only demands were that their Emperor Hirohito would be spared of execution and torture. So the U.S. refused to that, and then they dropped 2 atom bombs. Um, and then I actually want to read a bit from an op-ed in the LA Times entitled "U.S. leaders knew we didn't have to drop atomic bombs on Japan to win the war. We did it anyway." So 7 of the United States' 8 five-star Army and Navy officers in 1945 agreed with the Navy's vitriolic assessment. Generals Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Henry Hap Arnold, and Admirals William Leahy, Chester Nimitz, Ernest King, and William Halsey are all on record stating that the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. And keep in mind too, it says in here, there's nothing in the principles of warfare that required Truman and Roosevelt to demand an unconditional surrender of Japan or Germany. Wars can be and often are ended with terms of surrender. Both presidents were willing to sacrifice countless people on both sides of the conflict to attain their demand for an unconditional surrender.
I think the most thorough work on that was done by Gar Alperovitz, who started in the mid 60s and for about 30 years wrote about this extensively. And the last book he wrote about it, I think it was called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, which is massive, was fantastic because he talks about these military officers who oppose the use of the atomic bomb and goes into great detail about it. The United States already knew that Japan was in terrible condition. Japan was on the verge of surrendering. Japan's biggest fear was that the Soviet Union not invade. There was a book that came out by a Japanese scholar a few years ago called Racing the Enemy by a guy named Hagasawa. And the real fear was that the Soviet Union would declare war against Japan, which the United States wanted it to do in early 1945. But then, as it became more and more clear that Japan was really kind of on the verge of collapse, the US didn't want the Soviet Union in the war. And that's why the atomic bomb became important. It wasn't militarily necessary. And pretty much everyone involved with it at the moment said that. And even if you look at Truman, who said, I did it to save 1 million lives, that came after the fact. 2 or 3 years later, one of his aides wrote an article for him in 1948 when he was running for re-election at Harper's. And it was called something like, why I dropped the atomic bomb. And it was just this fabricated story. No military analysis prior to that had come up with the idea, the number that 1 million people would be killed. That was just pulled out of air because it's a big number. And, so yeah, you're right. They gave this ultimatum. We want unconditional surrender. They ended up keeping the emperor anyway. So, the real issue at that point, and I think most people who study this closely would agree, that the bomb was dropped to keep the Soviet Union out of Asia and to send a message that, in this post-war era, we have a nuclear monopoly and we're willing to use it. And that's part of this larger picture, this larger goal for global hegemony, global empire. And so the bomb, I mean, that's an easy, like you said, that's a no-brainer. That's easy. That violated, they attacked civilians, they attacked 2 civilian targets. And even before that, the fire bombings in Tokyo killed well over 100,000, just napalm bombings destroyed entire blocks. So this was a war waged against, civilians and, kind of the biggest industrial war at the time. And so it fit, every criteria. Had the United States lost the war, Truman and his group would have been in a docket for war crimes somewhere too. There was no question that it wasn't necessary to end the war, and it was an attack against specifically civilian targets.
Right, and to your point, Bob, I remember reading that Tokyo was not chosen because it had already been firebombed so many times. There was no targets left.
Exactly. And I think there were also both in Germany, which what, obviously they didn't use an atomic bomb in Germany, but in terms of choosing targets, I think one of the factors was that they did not want to hit like industrial plants and places where after the war they could foresee, kind of a reconstruction along capitalist lines. So, they thought this out. They weren't going into it, kind of bleary headed or innocent or naive or anything like that. In fact, Truman delayed a meeting in Potsdam in July of 1945 with Stalin because the bomb was about to be tested in Alamogordo. And once word of that successful test got back to Truman, who was on the way to Potsdam, he arrived. Truman's behavior changed entirely, and he became much more aggressive, much more assertive. And so Jimmy Burns, who was one of his aides, said, "I come from Texas, where people carry a gun on their holster," and he said, and that's what Truman was doing. He was carrying the atomic bomb around on his hip, like it was a piece, in Texas or something like that. So they knew what they were doing. This was clearly a cold-blooded decision to use this destructive weapon, this horrific weapon, and target, innocents there, because, yeah, like you said, they wiped out targets all over Japan and Germany both.
And to your point about expanding empire, they pretty much just used it to roll right into Korea, right? Because they were already worried about
The proxy.
more, they were already worried about communism spreading, right? Even then.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that became the, yeah.
Sorry to cut you off real quick. I think it started with the Chinese Revolution in 49, right?
Yeah, I mean, that clearly is a big part of it. The United States was well aware that Zhang Jieshi, the guy they were supporting in China, was not going to win that civil war, and yet they continued to pour tons, like billions of dollars and all kinds of aid into it. And so when the Chinese Civil War went the wrong way, then yeah, they anticipated more problems. The Cold War in Europe, I think, was settled fairly quickly. And there's a lot of stuff, I don't know how much detail you want to go into, but the United States had a plan for the post-war early on. Things like the Bretton Woods system to rebuild the global economy. They created NATO, which is still an issue today, right? NATO really doesn't have a purpose in 2024, but you still have countries joining it, and you have more and more gazillions of dollars being spent on it. You have things like the National Security Act, NSC 68. We can talk about that if you want. But yeah, there's no doubt that, I mean, when the war ended, the United States wanted to rebuild Asia and create capitalist partners. And the key countries there, obviously, were Japan and China. And, in the early 40s, China seemed more reliable. But once Japan was defeated, the United States was able to go in there and rebuild it along their lines. There's a great book on this by John Dower called Embracing Defeat. And the point of it is that the Japanese actually embraced being beaten by the United States, losing to the United States. Because by losing to the US, they understood they would be rebuilt. Their fear was that the Soviet Union would defeat them, right? And so, hence the atomic bomb. And so after that, things like Korea became more important. Although even in early 1950, the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, was giving a talk, and they asked him what America's interests were in Asia. He didn't mention Korea, just 6 months prior to that. But I think that connects to things like NSC 68. When the United States develops all these plans for the post-war era, which are based on the idea that the United States economy has to be based on massive military spending in order to avoid what had happened before the war, like the Depression, then places like Korea became very important. That justified these massive expenditures and this intervention and all that. But Korea by itself, up to that point, was never really even a big deal. The U.S. didn't have that much interest in it. But, when the Cold War kind of took hold, everything became a vital interest. If there was an alleged communist somewhere in the hills, a million miles away from everybody, that country became a vital American interest, right? In order, you know what the BS is. We're going to preserve democracy, and we're here to support democratic institutions and all that kind of stuff. And clearly, Syngman Rhee in South Carolina, South Korea anymore, right? But
Yeah.
in South Korea, Syngman Rhee was no Democrat, and the people in Greece who the United States supported, that was a brutal regime, basically a fascist junta of colonels, So, yeah, I think that's all it does. It carries from one to the other. So the atomic bomb and things like the National Security Act and Korea, clearly. Korea, when the Korean War broke out, the United States military budget was somewhere around $13 billion. By the end of the war, just 3 years later, it was $65 billion. When the war ended, it continued to be close to 40 billion. So even though the war ended, there was no coming back. There was no rollback to a more sane version, because they understood that, this created markets, which is the real goal, right? The United States is able to use military aid to create markets, to force allies, to create allies, by essentially with carrot and stick. If you want to be on our side, we'll make all this money available to you. We can give you loans through the World Bank and the IMF. And if not, we have NATO, and we can fund, insurgents, and, train military people and things like that. So the U.S. kind of uses both the carrot of like aid and like things like the Marshall Plan or NSC 68, or it can use, the kind of coercion of things like NATO or intervention.
And I like that you said NATO doesn't really have a point anymore, or maybe not the one it started with, which was to try and wrangle in the Soviets, right? And keep an eye on them.
Yeah. But I also think, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, a bunch of Nazis got put in NATO.
Oh, yeah,
Legitimate Nazis were hired into NATO. And then also, of course, Operation Paperclip with NASA and other places in the United States. So it's like, did they really care that much about Germany doing what it was doing? They just turn around and put them in positions of power.
Yeah.
Like, come on.
Chomsky, once somebody was saying something about denazification, and Chomsky said, no, it's renazification, right? Because they brought these people back, especially the scientists, and they put them in positions of authority inside the United States. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was there was in the sorry, in the World War II era, one of the things that was on their minds was that they had just gone through, the aftermath of World War I, which was a disaster, and of course, the Depression, and they didn't want to see that happen again. And so military force and military spending became a huge factor. Before World War II, the U.S. had a fairly small military establishment. I mean, they had in 1940, they only had, I think, 200,000 men in uniform, and they didn't have many carrier groups, and they had to kind of undergo this massive rearmament campaign, which is basically what ended the Depression anyway. So they don't want to do that again, and military spending and military programs became a key. It's the United States, right? They're not going to spend government money to build schools and hospitals and public works and community programs, and that's socialism, right?
Right.
But the one thing you can use government money on is the military, right? Because that's your security, right? And so that became the selling point. And this is, and the important thing here, I think, is this is really liberal. This is a liberal idea. And this is where liberals really have to own it, because the critique that the conservatives had was something similar to what we might say, I think. They thought this is an era of big government and the United States is becoming an empire. I mean, Robert Taft Sr., who was like the ultimate Republican, really attacked, the National Security Act for that reason. He said, this is we're going to become a garrison state. Military preparedness now is more important than having like a civic life. And the U.S. jumped into that, again, clearly aware that creating this national security state, being always prepared for war, having a permanent military establishment, having atomic bombs, having planes that could fly, ICBMs, became the keystone of American foreign policy, and that was guaranteed income to the military industrial companies. I could go on and on. There's one vignette, though, I think it's interesting and important. It comes from a book by a guy named Frank Kofsky about the war scare of 1948. When the Cold War when World War II ended, the American airline industry was in bad shape, because no longer did they need all of these. They wouldn't be getting all these sales, right, for military airplanes. And, commercial airline industry hadn't taken off yet. Mm-hmm. So when there was a coup in Czechoslovakia and then the Berlin crisis, the U.S. really, really played this up. And Kofsky found all this communication between military industrial corporations and very influential U.S. senators. And in 1948, I believe, something like 11 of those 16 companies had lost money. But after the war scare, which was by and large contrived, something like 13 of those 16 companies made money. And so they actively, contrived this idea that, the Soviet Union was on the march and they were going to be a threat and all this in order to gin up this military spending, especially for the Air Force. And, it was all contrived. And this is what we've seen throughout the entire Cold War. The kind of building up of enemies searching for enemies is a keystone of all of that in order to legitimate what you're doing here at home. And, the United States, let's be real, is not threatened by any outside force. There could be like a terrorist action, right, which is unstoppable. But, the United States has never been in any kind of vulnerable position since 1945. And so all of this rhetoric and this fear in NSC 68, it was just this like, we're the free state and they're the slave state. This hardcore rhetoric was all contrived with the goal of creating an American economy, an American society that would be heavily based on militarism and obedience and surveillance and those kinds of things that we're seeing today.
Something that always stood out to me for years was just knowing that Eisenhower, in his presidential farewell address, actually specifically mentions the military-industrial complex and warns against it as a president in the 1950s, if not the 60s. I might have my dates wrong here, but a long time ago, while he was sitting president.
Yeah. That was in early 1961, right before Kennedy was inaugurated. In 1953, Eisenhower had just become president. Right after Stalin died, he gave a famous speech called the Cross of Iron speech. You've probably seen it quoted, where he says, for every bomber built, that's the equivalent of a hospital, or that's the equivalent of a school. He has that whole litany of like, we're spending all this money. And he said, this is no way of life. This is humanity hanging by a cross of iron. And this is Eisenhower, as you pointed out, 5-star general. You never heard Kennedy say that, never heard LBJ say that. You certainly didn't. You didn't hear Jimmy Carter or any of these guys say that, right? It was Eisenhower, and Eisenhower invaded, intervened in places like Guatemala and Iran, and it was the government. So he's certainly, saying, but you're right. And I think that's really an important factor in all this. These are liberal ideas. This idea, it goes back to Woodrow Wilson. Liberalism now, when we think of liberalism, we think of, like gay marriage or transgendered issues or civil rights or abortion rights or something like that. It starts out as an economic ideology based on power and markets and free trade and things like that. Places that the United States would have an advantage because it's such a big economy. And so liberalism and these are liberal ideas. Bretton Woods is a liberal idea. The Security Act is a liberal idea. NSC 68 is the Cold War is a liberal idea. Korea is a liberal war. Vietnam is a liberal war, right? And so all of these things I think really need to be taken in. And it really, I can never understand after the Vietnam era how Democrats and liberals were always being attacked as doves, right? They want to make America weak. They don't want to fight, which is preposterous. Democrats are behind the Cold War and like the post-war era, So it's odd how they kind of get tagged as this party of being kind of wimpish when in fact they're interventionist, and we're seeing that today, right? And all over, but especially in Gaza, which is just horrific, right? But these are Democrats, and it's just crazy that
it's nuts. So one thing I wanted to say when you were bringing up the idea of like creating this economy out of militarization and kind of how they needed to go looking for enemies, right? Early on it was the Red Scare, right? It was everybody's a commie. Everyone's a commie, right? Godless heathens, atheists are communists, all that bullshit, right? But it's morphed into putting military bases everywhere around the world, and then saying things to the people that live in the United States like, hey, China's a threat to us. Like, brother, we got 800 military bases. There's all kinds of bases in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? That are just like, they're not a threat to come and invade the United States. They're not even a threat to try and drop a bomb. Could they? Sure. But that's not, when they say that, it's America, the United States is what? A couple hundred miles off of China's coast, probably in some cases, right? And obviously in Taiwan, I don't know how far it is across that strait, but like Taiwan is not far from China, and they're like
less than 100 miles.
Proxy. Yeah, they're like our proxy, like Israel is the United States proxy, right? So it's like it's just propaganda. It's just, we're gonna do this and then say they're a threat so that we can ramp up military spending. That's pretty much what it looks like to me.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it is. China has what, 2 bases, I think, and it has, I think, 2 or 3 carrier groups. The U.S. has 11. Yeah. So, and it's internationally recognized. There's a one China policy in 1979, where the United States acknowledged that Taiwan is part of China. So, yeah, this is all contrived stuff. Absolutely. The whole kind of threat, this kind of ginning up this threat with China, which Trump and Biden are doing the same thing. There's really no distinction between the two.
Right.
Is really terrifying, right? China's has nothing to gain by blowing Taiwan up or anything like that. They're really interconnected there. And again, it's just an exaggerated threat, which is what they've been doing, right? Communist or terrorists or Muslims or Arabs or whatever, just fill in the blank as the threat of the day. And it goes back to 1945. I mean, the famous Truman Doctrine, which I mentioned, which I think is important in this regard. The government of Greece had traditionally been funded by the British, but after World War II, Britain was in terrible shape, so they passed them off to the United States. And the Greek government was this kind of neo-fascist junta of colonels that was being attacked by this leftist group, this Civil War rebellion, whatever you want to call it, and who were vicious. The government was vicious. They were just killing people, right? Socialists, human rights workers, professionals, intellectuals, whatever. And Harry Truman was talking to one of his Republican counterparts, a senator, who said, if you want to get this money, you're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people. And so they contrived this idea that Greece was full of communists and Joe Stalin was trying to take over Greece. All absolutely made up, no evidence at all. The U.S. diplomats in Greece, in fact, were saying there's no Soviet role here. Stalin and Churchill had met, and Stalin basically said, Greece is your issue. I don't have anything to do with it. But when it came time for Truman to go to Congress, he asked for like $400 million, which in 1947 is a lot of money.
A shitload of money.
And he said, we're doing this to protect countries from outside subversion, implying that the Soviet Union was trying to take over Greece, which was never happening. So the United States funds Greece. This government becomes even more vicious. By the end of the Civil War, revolution, rebellion, whatever you want to call it, something like 200,000 Greek people on the left, socialists, intellectuals, whatever, were killed. So, they contrived this idea that Greece was being undermined by the communists, right? Even China, I mean, China may have had a communist revolution. China was not about to attack the United States or anything like that, right? So, every time and you could go to 1956 at Suez with Nasser, or 1958 with Lebanon and Iraq, or Cuba, of course. I mean, it just goes on and on. I could give you a million examples of it, but this is right. Let's contrive this idea. Let's create this enemy and talk about how threatened we are by them, and how, like today it's Hamas, right? Hamas did everything, right?
Right.
Yeah. So you can just do that, right? And you don't have to have a discussion, right? If in 1948, if somebody says something and you question, Henry Wallace, who was a good liberal in 1948, ran for president, who was viciously red-baited by the Democrats, by his own party as much as by the Republicans, right? Simply for saying we should seek peace with the Soviet Union, right? And this was enough to really terrify people, right? Just saying we should seek, and like today, how they throw anti-Semitism out anytime you say anything, right? The Jewish Voices for Peace becomes anti-Semitic. It's just a bizarre world. But again, it's not new. This is the way they've done things for a long time now. And it's a liberal idea. I keep going back to that. I think it's really important to understand. All these things we're talking about, war crimes, imperialism, militarism, military, those are all liberal conventions.
Right. You mentioned Cuba. I want to go there after you make your point, Craig.
Sure. I was just gonna follow up with the heck was it? Oh, you said, started off with communists, replace it with terrorist or with something else, right? I was listening to, I don't know if it was a radio broadcast or an actual speech from like the 40s or 50s, some Red Scare era, like propaganda. And if you just took out the word communist and put in the word terrorist, you could release it tomorrow unedited, and it would be exactly the same rhetoric you heard then as you do now. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, just at different times. It could be like Ho Chi Minh, it could be Castro, it could be Saddam Hussein, and
right.
It's just amazing that people still accept this. They still fall for it because they've been doing it for nearly a century, and it's all been exposed as BS. But and the media clearly goes along with this too. There's a lot, there's the media and politicians have a real strong interest in perpetuating these ideas in order to maintain control, to maintain the spigot of military spending, to keep people afraid. I mean, another part of this, in addition to things like military spending and militarism, is at home. It's the surveillance, society we have at home, which is all part of that too, right? Not only are there communists in Greece and China, but they're here in the United States, and they're coming to get you, and we need loyalty. And loyalty also was a Truman thing, right? The AFL-CIO was attacked by the Democrats, right? For having, been infested with communists. I mean, the Kennedys were friends and big supporters of Joe McCarthy and Roy Cohn. So, this really, if there's anything in America, there's not much in America that's bipartisan, but this clearly is. Surveillance, militarism, military spending. These are all there's no party affiliation with this, right? I don't, the Vaughn and Squad, I don't even think they vote against military budgets, right? Bernie Sanders and the Squad votes for military budgets, right? So it's, it's a bizarre world. And ironically, like I said before, sometimes it's conservatives who actually, kind of give a critique of it, right? I mean, somebody like Ron Paul, Ron Paul can be nutty, but on certain issues like Cuba and Israel, I kind of agree with pretty much everything he says.
Yeah, because it's a libertarian take on foreign policy, which is often where we align on the left.
Yeah, I don't agree with their ideology, but I think their basic idea, which came out in the 40s, was that the president is becoming too powerful and too strong. We're developing an imperial system. And, if we don't have any brakes on this, then the U.S. is going to do whatever it wants in the guise of national security. This is Robert Taft saying this, right?
Mm-hmm.
None of the Democrats they were all in on it. And, the architects of this were people like Dean Acheson and Clark Clifford and Bernard Baruch and a bunch of bankers and Wall Street investors and people like that. So that economic counterpart to this is important as well. It's not really militarism to protect the United States. I mean, that's an element, but yes, isn't threatened. In 1960, when JFK was talking about the missile gap in his debates with Nixon, the United States in 1960 had 20,000 nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union had 800. Right? And that's the missile gap. He was right. But the United States has never, it's in class when I teach about this, I joke, it's like the Yankees playing like a high school baseball team or something. Right? Right? The U.S. had this massive, overwhelming advantage in power. And yet they continue to stoke this anxiety and this fear that, somebody's coming to get you. And they also did it at home by going after, like the Rosenbergs, and you had the Red Scare, and the absurdity of that, right? They're going after people in Hollywood and people who are in education and people in sports, you name it, and it continues this fear factor, which was really crucial in that, because if people are afraid, then you can kind of surveil them, you can spend their money, you can do whatever you want, and you're not going to give them public education, you're not going to give them public health, you're not going to give them libraries, you're not going to give them health clinics, because that would be socialism, right?
We can't have a well-informed proletariat.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think like last year or this spring, when the campuses were being attacked, I mean, that's the first thing that came to mind. Like in the 60s, that scared the hell out of these people, because these students in the 60s were taking what they learned about democracy and freedom and free expression. They were doing it. They were putting it into practice, which terrified these university presidents and these politicians, right? Yep. And this is why you get the bullshit like you got this year at Columbia and Penn and Harvard. I have no pity at all on these presidents who were forced to resign because they tried to straddle this middle ground. They were attacked by the right, when in fact they were the ones who were, they were attacking Palestinian students and even Jewish students who protested for peace, right?
Yep.
And that's a big part of this. It's all connected, which is why, it's a big topic, but I think it's important. And again, if you look at this spring, the president's Biden, right? The governors in a lot of these states where there were protests, places like New York and California, are Democrats. A lot of these cities were Democrats, and they were the ones cracking down on the students, kicking them out of school, suspending them, sending the police out, these vicious thugs. Well, you could probably say that about 2020 too, right? With the mayors in a lot of these big cities who were sending the police out in 2020, right? The Democrats are somehow being accused of defunding the police when in fact they've ramped up their funding by
Yeah.
what is it, 300 billion or some insane
Yeah.
amount like that.
The vice
Yeah.
president sent the fucking National Guard into Minnesota, like into Minneapolis
And
after George Floyd.
he also set up task forces during the pipeline protests, which brought together the various law enforcement groups in that area to go after, I mean, indigenous people whose land was being attacked and invaded to build these pipelines were attacked by police. They were thrown in jail. They had their land taken from them. Right. And that's Walz, who, you know, as far as Democrats go, is probably one of the better ones.
Right.
Yeah.
Which says a lot.
No kidding.
Yeah.
No
So,
kidding.
how do we want to do this exactly? I want to cover Cuba. So I think maybe we should just start with Bay of Pigs, because we're not just doing war crimes, we're also just talking about major presidential fuck ups.
Yeah.
Bay of Pigs
The last
is
thing,
about...
yeah. One thing I want to say before that, and I'll be short. I know I always said I'll be brief, but because this is something people don't know either. In Korea, in the first stages of the Korean War, the North Koreans invaded the South. They crossed the 30th parallel, went into the South, and almost won the war. But then the U.S. came in 1950, sent troops in and pushed them back. At that point, the United States unleashed this vicious bombing campaign against Korea, which killed hundreds of thousands of Korean citizens. They unleashed the South Korean army to attack and kill North Korean POWs. So it became this vicious thing, right? So that was going on in Korea as well. And that's kind of an unknown part of this. But the United States, especially its air war, committed like massive, large-scale atrocities in the Korean War. And again, I'm not trying to like turn Eisenhower into a saintly figure, because he's not, but it was Eisenhower who ended the Korean War, right? He's like, I'm going to go to Korea and I'm going to end the war. So again, this is liberals who, you know, the same people who dropped the atomic bomb destroyed in this vicious attack on civilians. Who knows how many hundreds of thousands. And by the end of the war, about 2 million North Koreans were dead, most of them via American air power. And again, that is a war crime any way you cut it. So I think that's important, because you were talking about Cuba, and that reminded me that, oh yeah, this isn't, you know, this is kind of par for the course. But Cuba obviously is a big example of it.
Yeah, I want to cover Cuba and Vietnam right now. So how do we even break down the level of just sheer failure of Bay of Pigs?
Yeah, you know, the U.S. had been trying to get rid of Castro since January 1st, 1959.
Yeah.
And the Bay of Pigs was just a really dumb idea. And there were people there were actually military, you know, kind of a side thing. I don't know if you're familiar with, but I've been at war for like 2 years with the Oliver Stone JFK people, right? Who say that Kennedy was actually a dove, and Kennedy was going to get out of Vietnam, and Kennedy was going to make peace with Castro, and Kennedy was going to end the Cold War. There's just no evidence for any of that, right?
No, there's a lot to the contrary, matter of fact.
Well, exactly, and that's what I keep saying. And this is back, you know, when Chomsky was more active, right? I did a couple shows with him on this. This is an issue that was important to him as well. And that's what he would always say. Tell him to look at the evidence. And that's what I would always say, because I've talked to like Jefferson Morley and Jim DiEugenio, and they'll say like, well, you know, in 1954, Kennedy had a conversation with this guy, and he said Vietnam's a bad idea. That's not evidence, you know. But the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy had been warned this is a bad idea. The U.S. was aware that Castro had popular support. The United States was backing this brutal regime, you know, the Batista regime, right? Mm-hmm. And so it shouldn't have been a surprise when Castro's people, the communists, they weren't even communists then really, won the revolution in Cuba, right? They actually, I mean, the U.S. actually pushed them further to the left. I'm not trying to pretend they're not communists, but the fact of the matter is Castro's not an idiot. He realized you don't want the United States as your enemy trying to get rid of it, because it's a big country with a lot of guns, right? And the U.S. kind of forced the issue. But as soon as Castro came to power, Eisenhower was still president. He met with his aides, including Americans who owned land and businesses in Cuba. And so it was clear from the start, right? As soon as Castro announced like redistribution, he announced land reform programs and things like that. So he was in the U.S. crosshairs immediately. Yeah. And you know, when Kennedy became, it was funny because during the debates in 1960, Kennedy attacked Nixon from the right and said Nixon was weak on Cuba. The Republicans allowed the communists to take over Cuba, right? Oh, and so this is Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy, the idea of Kennedy as a dove, it's nutty. It's incredible because the guy's whole career, have been based on, I mean, when I think of Cold Warriors, Kennedy's up there. I mean, Kennedy is, Kennedy and Truman, I think, and, Dean Acheson and others, but way more than anybody else, right? Even way more than Eisenhower and Nixon, right?
Severely escalated the war in Vietnam.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Bay of Pigs, it was just a dumb idea. He had been warned about it. And I think he just kind of like, part of it was, he felt, kind of cornered because he'd been talking about it so much, but he believed in this stuff. He believed that you should get rid of these people. He believed in the Monroe Doctrine, right? If you want to talk, I mean, we could start at the Monroe Doctrine, right? With this shit, right?
Yeah.
And he believed in the Monroe, he believed that these countries existed to provide raw materials and resources for the United States, right? Guatemala and Venezuela and Cuba and Brazil, Colombia. I mean, the U.S. is involved all over. Guinea, Guyana, everywhere. Yeah. Nicaragua, everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And the U.S. wants to maintain these markets. It wants these resources. It wants these raw materials, and it wants to make sure it has friends there. In the Cold War, Kennedy famously said that he was afraid of what he called the threat of a good example. I don't know if he used that phrase exactly, but that's what he meant. Basically, if a country like Cuba succeeds, which considering the intense pressure it was under, it actually did, right? I mean, when we talk about Gaza, which is horrific, I mean, Cuba's had like 60 years of not the physical attacks, right? But an embargo and economic pressure, and who knows how many, probably millions of Cubans either, had a bad life, didn't have a natural lifespan or something because of U.S. pressure there. So the Bay of Pigs attack was just this ridiculous idea that made things much worse, right? It was a disaster. Yeah. Everybody was captured. And it clearly, made Cuba aware. That's why, why wouldn't Castro want Soviet weapons in his country in 1962? Right? Why wouldn't he? I mean, the United States had the Bay of Pigs. They've been trying to assassinate you. They have all of these covert operations going on, right? So it's just a preposterous idea. And Cuba was in the crosshairs that entire period, both with Kennedy and LBJ. There was never any kind of recanting. There was never any attempt at a thaw or anything like that. Kennedy established throughout Latin America, not just in Cuba, right? These regimes. He started things like the School of Americas, right? These training programs for Latin American military officials, right? With military officials. He sent aid to some of the worst offenders of human rights. At one point, I think it was in the 70s in Latin America, I think pretty much every right-wing president was a graduate of the School of Americas. And that wasn't, and Jimmy Carter's part of that too. I mean, we'll get to him later or part two or whatever, because this is one of my, I actually admire Jimmy Carter after he left the White House. He did some good stuff, but as president, he's a war criminal. He's no different than the rest of them. But Kennedy, in terms of, he is. I mean, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, we did a really good show on that too. I mean, Kennedy gets praised for that. Kennedy almost blew the world up. Right?
Right.
He took these needless provocations. It was Khrushchev who was actually sober-minded throughout the whole thing and kind of withdrew. The Soviet Union had Cuba had Soviet missiles, but that's an independent country. That's a sovereign country. And the United States is essentially invoking things like the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, right? But Cuba had a right to just like Gaza has a right to defend itself. Cuba has a right to defend itself, and so you do what you need to do. There was no violation of international law with Cuba, with what Cuba was doing. With the U.S., yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're freaking training people in the Everglades to go back and right after the missile crisis, because people like Oliver Stone and Morley all say, well, Kennedy kind of had a come to Jesus moment, and he realized that, no, as soon as the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, Kennedy authorized an operation where these Cuban emigres training in Miami blew up a factory and killed 400 people. This is immediately after the Bay of Pigs. Nothing changed. Nothing changed after the Bay of Pigs. No, I'm sorry, the missile crisis or the Bay of Pigs. Nothing changed. The goal, the purpose never changed. We want to get rid of this government. We want to overthrow this government. And again, these are liberals. They made in, they're Democrats, they're liberals, absolutely.
The one of when you were talking about the American business owners in Cuba that wanted Batista to
Mm.
stay in power, a lot of them were mob guys, right? That
Yeah.
owned casinos and
Yeah, oh, yeah.
hotels and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Havana was the original Vegas.
Right.
Yep.
And some, if maybe I've heard a rumor, let's call it, that a lot of those mob guys were actually in the CIA.
Oh, some of them were like members of Congress.
Yeah.
You know, again, I'm kind of all over the place, but a few years ago, a couple times I've taught at the University of Venice, and the students, they're amazing. They're like 19 years old, and they're asking me these questions that most Americans would never have any idea about. So they asked me about the Cold War in Italy, and they asked about like the Vatican mafia, and I'd heard stuff, so I had to study it. But in 1946, the left in Italy did quite well in the elections. Like even communists did really well. So the U.S. freaked out. They spent $100 million. The CIA, the Vatican, and the mafia worked closely to undermine the left in Italy.
Jeez.
And one of the groups that supported that intervention the most was the AFL-CIO, the AFL and the CIO. They weren't merged yet. But even the communist CIO, they sent labor representatives to Europe to undermine leftist unions, like socialist unions. So, when you brought that, it reminded me that, yeah, this is just like the people in Cuba, right? They are using these resources, including the mafia and the CIA and all of these kind of operatives, to overthrow a legitimate government.
It's craziness.
And yeah, well, you mentioned like the Cuba thing. The famous part is right in the second Godfather, when they're at that meeting with the gold phone. That phone is real.
Yeah.
I was at the sheriff AT&T had it made for Batista. So yeah, the American business, I forget what the number is now. The amount of investment they had in Cuba was huge. And so when Castro took over, they talk about freedom and democracy and all that bullshit, humanitarian intervention. But I mean, American investments were lost. Castro was funny because he said he would be willing to expropriate this American land, but he was going to do it based on what the American companies claimed on their taxes, what they claimed they were worth on their taxes.
Okay.
And of course the Americans said, no, we're worth way more than that.
Yeah. Caught them in their lies.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Well, then you have
but yeah.
some of the. I
No,
just wanted to mention some statistics related to Kennedy and Vietnam for people that think for some reason that Kennedy was some sort of a dove. So just going off numbers, under the Geneva Accords, the United States was permitted to have 685 military advisors in southern Vietnam. So Eisenhower secretly sent a few
600?
thousand. They were authorized to have 685. So Eisenhower sent several thousand, meaning like 3,000 or 4,000. And Kennedy quadrupled that. There were over 16,000 military advisors in Vietnam under Kennedy.
Yeah.
Military advisors.
Yeah. And then so in 1963,
Spies.
Kennedy's Secretary of State, Alexis Johnson, was speaking for the Economic Club of Detroit. And he says, what is the attraction that Southeast Asia has exerted for centuries on the great powers flanking it on all sides? Why is it desirable, and why is it important? He just says it. They used to just say shit,
Mm-hmm.
We're getting back to that. It provides a lush climate, fertile soil, rich natural resources, a relatively sparse population in most areas, and room to expand. The countries of Southeast Asia produce rich exportable surpluses such as rice, rubber, teak, corn, spices, oil, and many others. Kennedy, so that was from Howard Zen's A People's History of the U.S. Kennedy, unsurprisingly, took a much more politically savvy approach to justification for U.S. involvement in Vietnam by speaking to the American people about communism and freedom. So in a news conference on February 14, 1962, he said, yes, as you know, the U.S. for more than a decade has been assisting the government, the people of Vietnam, to maintain their independence.
It all comes back to settler colonialism. It really does.
South Vietnam was never a country. The U.S. invented it. They just created it because Vietnam was a contiguous country.
Right.
So in 1954, after defeating the French, the U.S. kind of invented a country, put Diem in power. Diem had no popular backing. I mean, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong, and I left later, were I mean, Eisenhower, again, bringing Eisenhower said, if there's a real election in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's going to win 90% of the vote. Everybody knew that, right?
Yeah,
So they had
yeah.
to create this whole thing, and Kennedy, from the start, he had you went from whatever the numbers were. By November of 1963, when he was assassinated, there were 16,700 troops in Vietnam. In addition to that, Kennedy sent helicopters in, he sent armor in, dioxins like Agent Orange, napalm. So Kennedy significantly ratcheted up the war. He had American advisors going out on operations with Southern Vietnamese troops, right? And my first book, which I think is really important in this, and again, I bring this up with the Kennedy people all the time. My first book is on military's approach to Vietnam. U.S. military officials, I'm talking about all head of Joint Chiefs of Staff, generals in Vietnam, all over, right? All said, Vietnam is not a good idea. It's not a good place to fight a war. It's not really that important to us. It's not going well. And so Kennedy, had he really wanted to get out, really had an excuse in his hand, right? Well, this isn't going well. He could have blamed corruption in southern Vietnam, but instead, what's he do? He has a coup. He engineered a coup, and just in early November 1963. I mean, if you're trying to get out of a country, you don't overthrow the government, the guy you put in power, right?
Right.
And then you send even more assistance in. I mean, Kennedy's fingerprints are all over Vietnam. I don't have a lot of sympathy for Johnson, but in a sense, Johnson inherited a really horrific situation from JFK. I mean, the only thing I would say is I think JFK is worse than LBJ in that one, right? But yeah, everything he did, troops, napalm, things like My Lai was really a pretty regular occurrence, My Lai type operations, right? Yeah, right. The Tiger Battalion, just these tons of stories, right? Which were happening. And if you ever look at like soldiers in Vietnam, created something called the Winter Soldier Organization. And they went around the country and they had what they called Winter Soldier hearings. And in it, they talked about what they saw and did in Vietnam. This isn't secondhand information. Like, this is like, we saw this, right? And they corroborated it. They proved it, right? They had their credentials, they had photos. And, some media picked up on it, but it was clear cut, right? That American policy was to kill people. And, something like 3 million Vietnamese overall were killed. Again, mostly civilian. 15 million were turned into refugees. And then that doesn't even take into account the sideshows, right, in Cambodia and Laos. And today in Cambodia and Laos, there are still many, many thousands of unexploded mines, unexploded ordnance. So every year in these countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, hundreds, if not 1,000 people are getting killed by bombs that were dropped 30 or 40 years ago, not to mention dioxin and Agent Orange, which is still in the water, creating birth defects. It was, what we're seeing, like, I think what we're seeing in Gaza today, because we see it every day, is so horrific and so terrifying. If there had been like Twitter and that stuff in the 60s, you would have been seeing in Vietnam, people being blown apart, civilians, children. At My Lai, women were raped and then murdered. Children were killed, brutalized. So this is kind of the way they fight the wars, right? From the most moral armies in the world, right?
Yeah, and to your point about the media, Vietnam was the first war that was really exposed by the mainstream media to the U.S. public. So that is what started turning the tide and really intensified the protest movement.
Yeah, which is why since then the media has been kind of brought to heel, right? And they're not given access like they were in the Vietnam era. Another thing I think that's really important in Vietnam, what you still see today, is like a lot of soldiers came home and were very active in the anti-war movement. Because the myth is that they all came home and that hippies spit on them at the airport. There's a great book on that called The Spitting Image, which is like, it never happened, right?
It's made up. It's made up.
Yeah. And so, anti-war vets were really crucial to the movement, and as they are today, right? You have groups like anti-war groups, you have Jewish Voice for Peace, Never Again, right? And the media somehow kind of blocked that out, right? And they created this myth instead that, like, hippies were mean to veterans, which really wasn't, that didn't happen, right? I mean, there might have been a hippie somewhere calling somebody a baby killer, but realistically, that didn't happen. And it just kind of, the media is a partner in this. When they talk about the liberal media, there's actually a point. It always struck me like it was Trump, of all people, who was able to make hay with this idea of fake news in the media, right? When we've been saying that forever, haven't we, on the left, right? That's our critique. And nobody listened to it, and then Trump is able to steal it. So
Yeah.
Crazy.
The CIA in Vietnam also had this program called Operation Phoenix, where they just straight up murdered over 20,000 suspected communists in South Vietnam without trial or anything.
It's kind of like Hamas too, right? If they're dead, they're VC. Like, the body count was a big deal even before Phoenix, right? But the idea of Phoenix is we're getting rid of they call it the VCI, the Viet Cong infrastructure, right? Well, if you go into a village and kill 400 people, the records would say we killed 400 Viet Cong, right?
Right.
I mean, in My Lai, we're killing communists in My Lai, right? Or we're killing communists in, wherever, right? And what's crazy, if you look at a bombing map of Vietnam, the vast majority of American attacks occurred below the 17th parallel. The U.S. blew up the country it had invented and its ally. So the United States is sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Vietnam, but the war is actually occurring below the 17th parallel for the most part. And it got, the attacks in the north became more common after 1968, after Tet. But the United States, 2/3 of American bombings occurred in South Vietnam, in southern Vietnam, the country the U.S. was supposed to be there to preserve and save. And what other war do you blow up your own country? You blow up your own ally,
Didn't they do that to Seoul? During the Korean War too. They destroyed most of Seoul.
That's why I wanted to mention that earlier, because I think the Korean, like most people don't know about Korea, but Korea is similar to the Vietnam in that regard. It's war crimes on a daily basis that are just part of American policy. And I think the difference in Vietnam, which is really important, is things like the Winter Soldier Organization and the media coverage, and Time Magazine putting had an issue where they had a photo of every American killed in the war in that particular week, right? Whereas now, the media is all in, right? And, everything is Hamas or everything is anti-Semitism or whatever, right? And you just had this like horrific, Democratic convention where they didn't want to talk about it, right?
Right, and it's even a step further than that, because you fail upward. If you don't criticize the war, if you don't criticize the national security apparatus, you get promoted, you get more airtime, and the opposite is true. If you cover the war and you cover the national security apparatus more, you get less airtime, you don't get a primetime slot, or you even get fired. In the case of like Mehdi Hassan from MSNBC, he started talking about Gaza. They started giving him less and less airtime, and then eventually he got dismissed from the network.
Yeah. I mean, Phil Donahue died, was it last week? And that happened to him in 2003. He and Jesse Ventura were shit canned by, was it MSNBC? Because they were talking about the war in Iraq, right? So I mean, it's funny because you do it. The media is liberal. Like I don't have any issue with that, but people assume that liberals are somehow like anti-war or they want a better world or something. And they're, that's the problem. They're not. And, and that's why I wanted to talk about this, because if you look at their ideology, I mean, this is their blueprint, even more than conservatives. I mean, I mean, it was weird. One day I had the computer on, I wasn't watching. I heard this person talking about Syria, like, and it was like probably the kind of stuff you would say is what I would say, right? It was Matt Gaetz, talking about how the United States is, trying to escalate the conflict in Syria, right? And, who the hell knows what's in his mind or anything like that. But the fact is, no Democrats saying that. AOC wasn't saying that, right? Bernie Sanders wasn't saying that. Right? So I think Rashida Tlaib may have been, because she's the best of that group, right? But it's crazy how people have this kind of binary thing about liberals do this and conservatives do that. Well, liberals actually, I mean, if there's a war or an intervention, there's a good chance liberal fingerprints are going to be all over it.
It's the capitalist class, right?
Yeah.
That's who's doing it.
Yeah, when we get to Jimmy Carter, well, that's why, like, I have issues with conspiracy theory, right? This idea that this hidden group of people, it's like, I don't think they're hidden. They're kind of doing it. Like, they're not really hiding it, They're
running around in broad daylight.
Yeah, I mean, was it in 2022, before Russia actually invaded Ukraine, the Twitter accounts of like Raytheon and General Dynamics were gleeful about the amount of money they were about to make if Russia invaded. Like, they're not hiding it,
Right. Yeah, totally.
But Yeah, I think, I remember you point out, like in Vietnam, you have, Agent Orange, white phosphorus, uh, these search and destroy operations, right? Kill everything that moves operations, right? Um, you know, the Americans had this program called Hearts and Minds, the idea that you would go in and convince the people of Vietnam that you were there to help them. But the soldiers had a joke. They said, grab them by the heart. What was it? Grab them by the balls and their hearts and minds will fall. So even something that was allegedly like civic action or pacification was based on coercion. The original goal for empire would be based on money. It would be based on economic power. Send the bankers in instead of the soldiers. But you always had the soldiers there if the bankers didn't get their job done the right way. And so, the Cold War is full of intervention. Venezuela, Iran, Guatemala, the Suez, Iraq, Lebanon, go on and on and on and on, Latin America. And so the idea there is like, if you're not willing to be part of our vision for this global capitalist empire, then we'll get rid of you. We'll get rid of you. And I mean, Trump is very open about that, right? But he and Biden, I don't think there's any difference between how they really think about this stuff. But Biden wants, and Harris, the crocodile tears and all this kind of stuff. Obama, they're all war criminals.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, or even people outside the government but are obviously connected, like Elon Musk. He just says we'll coup whoever we want. We'll go into Bolivia. We'll take it all.
Yeah. There's lithium.
Yeah. Unreal.
I mean, sometimes people will say, "Oh, that's a rudimentary analysis, or that's crude imperialism." It's like, yeah, but that's what they do.
That is exactly what they're doing.
I mean, if you have, copper in Chile, right? In 1971, you had two American copper companies there who were afraid of being nationalized, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oil in the Middle East, or land, United Fruit Company land in Guatemala. The U.S. had a ton of investments in Cuba, including in the gambling industry, right? And so, one of the things about Vietnam too, you mentioned, like when you read that quote from UXS Johnson, another part of Vietnam that's really important is the United States, especially after if you want to talk about Vietnam, you can actually go back to the Chinese Civil War, which you mentioned earlier. After the Chinese communists won that revolution, right, and China became communist, getting countries to be friendly and to be trading partners with Japan became more important than ever. And so a place like Vietnam, in addition to the resources it had, was important because if it was communist, then they assumed it would be close to China, even though the Vietnamese and Chinese hate each other. The U.S. never really looked into that, right? So the idea there is we have to keep these countries from having any kind of, it could be communist, it could be neutralist, it could be nationalist, it could be so whatever. If you're not all in with us, then you're the enemy, right?
Right.
And so Vietnam is important in that regard too, because they want all of these countries in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, to be on good terms with Japan and to be trading with Japan and to be providing raw materials to Japan and to be purchasing small manufactured goods like transistor radios and things like that from Japan. So a lot of this is about markets, and a lot of the American programs were designed in order to get dollars into the hands of countries like Japan or Germany or Europe, because there was a so-called dollar gap. These countries didn't have money, so they couldn't purchase goods from the United States. The United States needed to sell stuff. So the U.S. gave them the money that they would use to purchase goods back from American suppliers, right? Mm-hmm. So the U.S. was subsidizing this, right? Now, again, the United States, they could have put these people to work, building bridges, fixing the infrastructure, building highways, building schools. You're not going to do that. That would be socialism, right? So everything has to be connected to this idea of security, which in reality is about markets, and it's about investment, and it's about resources and cheap labor, and stuff like that, which is really still part of the Asia. It hasn't really changed that much today, right? If you look at China and the United States, and you go to Walmart or one of the Dollar General stores, and I'd say over half the stuff in there is made in China.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes, the whole idea, we're seeing it now with what SCOTUS has been doing the last couple of years and just destroying every part of the administrative state that gets in the way of capital. And, but it's like, the idea we're going to go, what did I see? I saw something about how NASA just found some like amazing amount of natural resources on Mercury, the planet Mercury. And I saw some smartass on Twitter was just like, well, it looks like America's going to go spread some freedom and democracy on Mercury. And it's like, one, that's hilarious because that's exactly what America does. But two, like freedom to, SCOTUS in particular and the conservative legal project is freedom for them is I'm going to use my money and power to get more money and power. Right.
Yeah,
That's what they think democracy is. Right. And anything that gets in the way of it, they think is, communist or just, not capitalist, whatever dumb thing they come up with that day to tell you that it's not okay. Right.
That actually goes back because I mentioned earlier, Woodrow Wilson and the creation of liberalism. Wilson said that the United States had to fight World War I to make the world safe for democracy, right? And everyone says that's bullshit, right? Because, here at home, you're putting Eugene Debs in jail and you had race riots and all that stuff, right? But Wilson wasn't lying. In the liberal conception that occurred at the turn of the century when liberalism kind of became the dominant ideology, democracy meant free markets. It meant free trade. I mean, sending your ships out with weapons on them to sell to the British and French and not getting them sunk or getting gold, even worse, right? You collect the gold that can pay for those weapons, and on the way back in the Atlantic, they're sunk. So if you go to business schools, even today, a lot of them will define democracy with terms like commercial freedom or commercial liberty. That's what democracy means to them. So in a sense, they really weren't lying. But again, this is a liberal conception. You mentioned SCOTUS, which is a good point, because the conservative attack on a lot of these programs in the 40s was precisely that the federal government would get too much power. Now, the Supreme Court today is clearly not the same as Robert Taft. They're different kinds of cats, and I have no idea. They're clearly power oriented. But part of it is that idea that in the 1940s there was this fear that the state would have too much power, right? And in this particular case, it was based on foreign intervention, which is not a bad thing. I would actually agree with it, right? Not what the Supreme Court is doing, with regard to things like carcinogens, chemicals, and things like that. But it actually does go back. It's a very old conservative idea. This Supreme Court has bastardized it terribly, and they're using it, in fact, to prop up their own powerful executive, right? In Trump, right? But it actually does go back to that. But these are all liberal ideas. The idea of that democracy really means commercial freedom. In the Cold War? You guys are young. You're way younger than me. But during the Cold War, one of the key points of propaganda was that in the Soviet Union they couldn't get blue jeans, or in the Soviet Union there were only two different types of toothpaste.
Yeah.
Or they didn't have Coca-Cola in the Soviet Union. It was all based on these consumer issues. And conversely, what does democracy mean in the United States? Well, you can buy whatever you want, right? You could go to Starbucks, you can go to your local coffee shop, you can buy this kind of beer, you can buy that kind of beer. So it tends to be this consumptive ideology, which is a liberal conception. That's what freedom means, the ability to purchase goods. On 9/11, again, I don't know how old you were at the time, but on the night of September 11th, 2001, Bush went on TV that night, and one of the first things he said, one of the key things he said, it was the first thing, but one of the key things he said was, don't let the terrorists defeat us. The malls are open, the department stores open. Make sure you go shopping. In San Francisco, Willie Brown, Kamala's mentor, I believe was mayor at the time, and he had
shopping bags made up to give out to just people on the streets with red, white, and blue stars. And the key point that whole week, I remember it well, was like, don't let the terrorists defeat you. Go shopping. It really was pretty crude. Like, Jesus. It really was pretty. It wasn't much more nuanced than that. If we don't live the lives that we've led, they can't, they hate us because of our freedom. And what's our freedom? We can go to the mall. We can go to the Galleria. We can go to the Mall of America. Whatever. Actually is when you brought that up, it reminded me, that's a great point, because that's what liberals believe democracy meant,
Yeah. Consumerism.
It's a huge part of it. It actually is, right? No, it really is. Yeah, absolutely.
You could go to the mall. I was in college when that happened. And, and I remember walking out of the place I was staying to go to class. Actually, I was driving to work. I don't know. At any rate, I was leaving where I lived to go to campus, and I get to this gas station, and there's like a 30 car line at the gas station. This was the morning of 9/11, and I was like, why are all these people at the gas station? I was so confused, and I looked at and then I happened to see how much it cost on the sign, and I was like, what is happening? And like, and it dawned on me later, quite a while later actually, that those were all the people that probably lived through that thing and through it in the 70s, right?
The
Where
gas crisis.
the gas crisis, right?
Yeah.
So they were all trying to get gas so that they could have so their cars would still function, right? And me,
Oh yeah,
I was, shit, what, that was 2001.
yeah.
Yeah, I was 21, 22, something like that. So very still young and naive to things back then. So it was baffling to me that it was like that. But the fact that you talked about him going to Tim Bush saying, go to the mall, like that totally checks out with the whole idea of like, you know, if you stop doing those things, then the terrorists win,
Yeah.
right? Just because
They were pretty explicit. They were pretty explicit about that. I'm looking at something here that I wrote, and I think it ties in, and it's kind of interesting because this is from Dean Acheson, who was the Secretary of State in 1949, right after the National Security Act, right before NSC 68. But they were doing studies, and in these studies at the highest level of government, all of these people, the Secretary of State, the State Department, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Pentagon, came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union developing the atomic bomb, which it had done, and the Chinese victory in the Civil War weren't that big a deal. Their bigger concern was that the lack of military spending would hurt the American economy. And so Acheson said, even if there were no Russia, if there were no communism, we would still face very grave problems in trying to exist and strengthen those parts of the free world which have been so badly shaken by the war. So he admitted, this isn't a public speech. Even if there was no Soviet Union, we'd have to do this, right?
Yep.
And the famous diplomat George Kennan came up with something which I talk about all the time in class. And he wrote a document in 1948. It was called PPS 23, Policy and Planning Staff Document number 23. And in it, Kennan said, we have 5% of the world's population, but 50% of its wealth. Our task in the coming years is to devise strategies to maintain this position of authority, of disparity. I'm sorry. Our goal is to maintain this position of disparity. Kennan didn't say our goal was to feed the world. Our goal was to bring world peace. Our goal is to help people eradicate malaria. He didn't say anything like that. Our goal in the coming years is to maintain this massive gap where we have 5% of the population and 50% of the wealth. That's America's goal. It's an economic program. It's not to preserve democracy. It's not to end communism. It is to fatten the coffers of these American corporations. And in 1950, that also meant the American lifestyle was much better. I mean, people worked. Working class people owned a home. They took a vacation. They owned a car. That kind of thing. So at that point, until around 1970, wages kept up. So you had this kind of lavish lifestyle, even for working people. Yeah. If you were white, for sure, right? That didn't, clearly was very different for women or for African Americans, right? Women still didn't have legal rights, right? They couldn't get credit cards and divorces and things like that. Right?
Right.
Yeah. But in 1950, it worked. This massive spending program, this federal spending program on weapons actually helped make the American economy what it was throughout the 50s. The amount of money spent is just immense on military equipment. And like I said, when the Korean War broke out, the budget was like 13 billion. By the end of the war, it's gone up fivefold, 65 billion. And then it didn't go down that far afterward. So you have this period. And Kennedy, despite what they say, going back to Kennedy, right? At the same time, he's ratcheting up things in Vietnam. He has a coup to get rid of the government. The military budgets under Kennedy went way up. Intervention against Cuba went way up. Cold War rhetoric went way up. Cold War incidents like the missile crisis happened. So in all of these cases, you don't see any shift. You see the steady progression in military spending and intervention. And, if anything, Eisenhower, who, again, there's no saying, but, in Eisenhower, you do see a taper off. And like I said, Eisenhower, Chomsky pointed this out. Kennedy could never made a speech like the Cross of Iron speech, that we're instead of building airplanes and bombers, we could be building schools and hospitals. Kennedy never said that, right? So, there's this rhetoric, and the liberals buy into it, and the conservatives attack him for it, and it's just all BS.
He was the what you can do for your country guy.
Yeah.
If that doesn't say it all right there, like, what can you do for the U.S. government?
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you read the whole thing, it's, in that he says, we will pay any price, bear any burden, we will do all this and more. Like, how do you do more than that?
Yeah.
I mean, if you read
Yeah.
the entire inaugural speech, it's pretty red-blooded. It's a lot of meat. It's a lot of raw meat for people, right? It's at the height of the Cold War. Like I said, the U.S. had 20,000 nuclear missiles, and the Soviet Union had less than 1,000. And the U.S. rhetoric was that the Soviet Union had this in the 1970s. The Soviet Union briefly caught up with the U.S. They each had like 45,000 nuclear weapons, but the Soviet Union briefly had more. But they didn't have launchers and they didn't have the planes. So even though they had more weapons, the U.S. was still in a much better posture, right? Which would be the case like today in Ukraine. Russia may have a lot of planes and a lot of soldiers, but a lot of Russian equipment is old and decrepit, whereas NATO's isn't, right? And it's unfortunate for me at least that we don't really talk about Ukraine anymore. And when you do, it's kind of like being accused of anti-Semitism. People would say, "Oh, you like Putin then," or "You're a bitch for Putin." I've been called that. It's like you can't talk about this stuff, right? I mean, the amount of money the United States is spending to fight a country which is encircled by 31 hostile countries in a military alliance. To me, that's the key point.
Yeah.
I have no use for Putin either, right? But the reality is, that this is a disaster. But after it's over, who's going to go in there, right? Who's going to look at Vietnam today? Who's in Vietnam today? American corporations. I wrote an article a few years ago on the 50th anniversary called "The U.S. Won the Vietnam War" was my theme. The United States won the war in Vietnam. It became the kind of country the U.S. wanted it to become. It became a market-oriented country. It has foreign investment. It has U.S. corporations there. The United States trades actively with Vietnam. And you're going to see that in Ukraine. You'll see that in Ukraine once this war is over. Goldman Sachs will be in there. BlackRock will be in there. All of these hedge funds will be in there. These corporations will be in there. Not Brown and Root anymore. Halliburton will be in there, right? And in one of my past lives, I was very active in organizing street stuff. And one of the big campaigns we did here in Houston was Scott Parkin, who's on the was a Halliburton KBR campaign in the run up to the war in 2003. We would go because their headquarters were in Houston. We would go to the headquarters once a week and have these big, vigils, and people would be out there to point out, like, this is a Halliburton war. This is a Dick Cheney war, right? Isn't it funny that Dick Cheney's daughter is now like the darling of the Democratic Party, the darling of liberals?
Yeah. They will rehabilitate anyone. They've rehabilitated George W. Bush.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, right? They'll let these people speak they won't let a Palestinian speak at the convention, but they'll let all these like anti-choice Republicans in,
Right.
But I feel that but talking to you guys has me even more pissed off now because like I'm putting it all together. Like, Jesus, really
sorry about that.
No, they're. I mean that's the point of this, right?
Right.
And I think it's important to get that out there because, Donald Trump's a scary guy. He's insane, right? But and I get it, and I get that people are afraid of him. I get that, but at the same time, don't lionize the other side because they're really not that different, And on issues like this,
just perhaps you've seen it, Bob. There's a meme where it's a liberal. He's going in the ballot box. It says fascism is destroyed, and then there's Hitler. And it's like, oh no. Like that's how they think fascism works. You can just vote it out.
Yeah, vote it away. Yeah.
Yeah, you just vote it out, right?
Well, and they they totally discount the fact that it's not something that happens overnight typically, right? I mean, certainly it could be if some random megalomaniac
and it's not announced either.
Power. It's not what?
It's not announced.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But typically it takes years, right, of eroding of civil rights laws and eroding of and propping up the military more and squashing dissent and all of that, right? And then all of a sudden someone like Trump does take over again, and that's when it, all the infrastructure's there at that point.
Well, what did Pelosi say earlier this year? She said, the CIA or somebody should be keeping a list of all these student protesters, which they're doing anyway, right? But
of course,
COINTELPRO never ended. Like, let's not kid ourselves.
Right. And you made a good point there because, like, what we've seen in the last 50 years, especially, this really starts like after Nixon becomes president. you have this erosion and this movement to the right by both parties. Scott and I actually just did a show on 1968, the lessons of 1968. For the right, they were attack the Democrats from the left, right? Attack them as being, acid amnesty and abortion and peaceniks and hippies and druggies and all that shit. But the Democrats took the same lesson out of it. Oh, we have to move further to the right because they're calling us these bad things. And then for a lot of activists, they took the same message, which is, okay, we can't be that hard on the Democrats. I've seen a lot of activists from 1968 recant and say, oh, I regret what I did because, Nixon won. Well, Nixon and Humphrey, you buy one, you get the other one free. It's not like Humphrey, or I've heard people talk about Al Gore. Nader killed Al Gore's chances. Like, well, Gore, how would Gore have been different? How was Gore going to be different than Bush?
Yeah, really.
So there's this fantasy, this kind of Disneyland fantasy. Oh, they're different, and they'll be like, no, not really.
No.
What gets me, and I said this about Biden and Harris, I don't really care, but if Harris would come out and say, what's happening in Gaza is unsustainable, we can't do that anymore, it's a violation of human rights, she'd probably go up 5 points in the polls. They're willing to lose an election.
Mm-hmm.
They keep telling us 8 freaking years, Trump is a fascist, Trump is a dictator, he's the biggest danger since Hitler. So what do you do to stop him? Oh, make sure you vote in 2024. That's their solution, right? He's the worst guy in the history of the world, but make sure you vote. That's how we're going to stop him, right?
Yeah, they're literally a meme.
Yeah, we've tried nothing. We're all out of ideas.
Right, you're right. Yeah. No, you're right. That's how you get rid of the guy, right?
Yeah.
Fascism destroyed.
Yeah. We'll just vote him out, right?
Yeah.
So we're about an hour and a half, so I think I'll probably cut it here, and we'll go into LBJ in part 2, if that's cool with you guys.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Hell yeah.
Awesome. So
can't wait to talk about Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So why don't you guys just shout out your shows, how people can find you, and then we'll just end it there.
Sure.
We'll start with you, Bob.
It's Green and Red Podcast. I think it's greenandredpodcast.org, I believe, but you can just do a Google search on it. And then I actually have a blog. It's called afflictthecomfortable.org, and which is, again, you could Google it or whatever. But yeah, Scott and I, we talk about some stuff like this. We talk about war. We talk about capitalism, and I really love what you're doing. By the way, I really appreciate this because it's neat to have this kind of collection of people, like-minded people, because it gets lonely out there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really great, and I really appreciate what you're both doing. I think it's fantastic, and in the future, I hope we could do more stuff together, because I think, if we put our, minds together, because, there's this like Brooklyn left and all these kind of liberals who are very potent and they have a lot of money. So, I think we have an important role to play in that too.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the kind words for sure. So I'm Craig, host of Voices from the Left podcast. You can find that on all the platforms. I'm at dystopian_grift on Instagram. I also run the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network Instagram account. And by the way, the Green and Red Podcast is a member of the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network. So, which is great. They were our first member. It was awesome. Really great to do some collab here. And, if anyone who has questions for any of us, you can find our emails in our bios and stuff on Instagram, and, we'll have it in the show notes for this too. So.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. As always, the 805 Uncensored is on all the major podcasting networks. We're on social media at 805 Uncensored Pod. If you have any questions, comments, shoot me an email, 805uncensored@gmail.com. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Hope everybody has a good night, morning, evening, wherever you're listening in the world. Stay safe out there. The revolution is you. Free Palestine.
That does it for the show. Thanks for listening. Voices from the Left is a presentation of the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network. Special thanks to Nick Josephs for the use of the theme song. You can find Nick on Spotify or on the web at nickjosephs.com. Don't forget to rate and review on whichever platform you listen. If you'd like to support the show, you can subscribe at patreon.com/voicesfromtheleft or donate at buymeacoffee.com/voicesfromtheleft. All the links will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and solidarity.